I'm delighted to be here talking to our guest, Isaac Stone-Fish, who is CEO of Strategy Risks, which is a data and research company specializing in diverse risk reduction, especially concerning China. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today. With technology being so central to geopolitics and especially the competition between the US and China, how do you see technology increasing, impacting the risk for businesses doing business in both the United States and China? And especially in a day when every company is a tech company, or at least, heading in that direction. How has technology enhanced the complexities of doing business in both markets?
As tech tools become more and more dual use, it's very challenging to say we're developing this technology and we're saying it doesn't have military implications, but if the People's Liberation Army or Ministry of State Security or a local Chinese office wants to use it for, say, facial recognition or tracking dissidents, that's another really major issue there. And then I think there's also a real sense that the country that wins the AI race is better placed to both win technology in the 21st century for whatever grand statements like that mean, but also has a really big leg up on a potential war between the US and China. And so these technologies and tools are something that are very, very contested.
Artificial intelligence is the name of the game right now. And almost every company is incorporating AI into their business model, into their business strategy. And it's also one of the most contested spaces in the tech race between the United States and between China, and who's going to develop it faster, better, and smarter, and which values is the AI going to advance. How do you see artificial intelligence complicating, impacting, having an effect on how companies are doing business in or with the US and China?
AI is such contested territory right now and seen as the vanguard of high tech. And so American companies both need to represent to the US government that they are the ones that can responsibly police their technology, but that they can also keep it free from undue influence from the party and undue influence from potential Chinese engineers in the business, while at the same time maintaining high ethical standards and not discriminating against their people. It's a very, very tricky and sticky line to walk. I think in terms of AI as a tool for governments, US tech companies, especially Microsoft and OpenAI, need to be aware of Beijing's willingness and ability to exploit their technologies for its military, for its surveillance state. And they need to understand that there is heightened risks in the United States and with their US government contracts of not really reducing those exposures to China.
You and I spoke, and we wanted to get together to have this conversation after it was reported by the Financial Times in May of this year that global consulting firm McKinsey had been advising Beijing under the firm's Urban China initiative, providing very detailed strategy recommendations regarding technology policy, industrial policy for the PRC and China's military, their People's Liberation Army. And I'm quoting here, it included efforts to strengthen the People's Liberation Army and undermine Western industrial companies. And that was according to U.S. Senators Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley in their letter to McKinsey about this. So the Urban China Initiative under McKinsey publishes a 300-page book, and it's detailing all of these recommendations about how to enhance the military and industrial capabilities of the Chinese government. And so now the senators have called on McKinsey to stop doing this business and advising China on these things at risk of losing their government contracts. So there's some really important lessons for business here. And it's not just a one-off, and you've been tracking this and we've talked about it before. There's multiple examples of lawmakers paying attention to this. In April, the China Select Committee found index providers and asset managers in the US facilitated investment of more than $6 billion to 60 plus PRC companies that the US has blacklisted. In February, that same committee identified 5 venture capital firms that had given $3 billion in investments, providing expertise to the PRC, their military. So there are some very new and very important things for business leaders to know about doing business in and with China, and especially the Chinese government. So we wanted to get together here at the Tech Diplomacy Academy and highlight these lessons for business leaders. What do business leaders need to know about Chinese government efforts to utilize U.S. companies or allied companies in doing business that serves the interests of the Chinese government, the Chinese military, the Chinese Communist Party, and potentially puts U.S. national security at risk?
So much of what was acceptable behavior in the 2000s and the 2010s with China, and especially with the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, is now considered unacceptable by U.S. Congress, by U.S. lawmakers, and by many U.S. citizens. And so businesses need to understand that they have to get out ahead of these issues and of these stories and look through their past, because if they can find something on the internet in the United States and China that shows embarrassing links between them and the Communist Party, even if these links are no longer extant, they should develop a PR and a government affairs strategy, because if these things do blow up, they're going to be quite embarrassing. McKinsey is facing pretty major issues reputationally and regulatorily from its work with Beijing. The second thing they should understand is that Beijing doesn't want them to do that. It doesn't want them to reduce their exposure to China and to the Chinese Communist Party. And so doing this is a very delicate dance between what Washington wants and what Beijing wants.
So you were talking a little bit about the potential PR risks, the government relations risks. As you're working with companies, and business leaders are more attuned to this, who inside of a company needs to be focused on this? Who's in charge? Because there's no chief geopolitical risk officer, or at least not yet, but who needs to be looking at this?
So I'll answer that in the negative. One important segment of the company which can't be managing these issues is the team in China, not because they're not brilliant, not because they're not intensely aware of all these political risks, but because it's dangerous for them. Beijing has many levers, judicially and extrajudicially, to put pressure and to arrest, to harass, to torture people in Chinese companies, people in American companies who go against what Beijing wants. It's very serious, and companies need to not put their Chinese staff or their staff located in China in danger. In terms of people who can deal with it, it's something we're seeing a lot more focus on from boards, because boards are seeing the writing on the wall, and they're realizing that both in the near term and the medium term, US and China are almost certain to keep decoupling, to keep moving further and further away. And so companies need to address this on a strategic level. On more of a working level, we see this from government affairs. We see this from press and PR. We also see this from compliance. And so sometimes the GC or someone in the GC's office who deals with ethics and standards will implement policies to reduce these risks.
Now, you had recommended companies go back and look at their past and their current business dealings with China and potential issues in part of the Chinese government. In some cases, it can be hard to tell, can't it? I mean, how is the Chinese government and the PRC coming to U.S. or allied companies? Is it overt? And are they saying, we're the Chinese government, we would like you to help us with our military and technology strategy? Or are they obfuscating that a little bit? Are there other companies, other brands, other organizations that may seem a little bit more benign? How can business leaders tell?
There's so much covert work happening here, and that is a major issue companies need to address. But the low-hanging fruit, the easiest part to address, is the stuff that is in public and that people can find and that congressional offices can find, because they love to make examples of this. So there's a company, a big US company, that was giving charity to a Chinese institution. So you see that and you think, oh, great, they're doing charitable givings. But then you look at the institution, you realize it's a Chinese orphanage that does party building. And so this storied US brand is giving money to an institution that's brainwashing Chinese children, almost what the orphanage says explicitly it's doing. And so the first port of call for companies is finding what's out there publicly that they can then change and reduce. The second piece is trainings and instilling the culture within the company to understand what these risks are and to behave responsibly and ethically around them. So to understand, oh, maybe I shouldn't go on this tour to this part of China. McKinsey infamously held a retreat in Xinjiang, the region in northwest China, where upwards of 1 million Muslims have been held in concentration camps. And McKinsey should not have held a retreat in Xinjiang. And McKinsey and other companies need to instill a culture where people understand that there are certain things that they should not do.
Do you see, with all of the different companies that you're working with, do you see an increased awareness of this type of risk and the national security considerations and the human rights considerations when it comes to doing business in and with China? Or what's the trend?
What we do see is an increased awareness of the regulatory and the PR risk. There are some people and companies who I think are very foresighted and notice the national security concerns and the ethical concerns, but much more it's, we have to pay attention to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which restricts our ability to import from Xinjiang in China. And so how do we make sure our supply chain doesn't have any of those risks? Or we're coming up to renew a major contract we have with the Pentagon, and we know the Pentagon is nervous about our military ties to China. So how do we reduce those? How do we understand those? But from a national security perspective, we're having this conversation when the Democratic Party is on fire and things are shifting rapidly. And I think there's really, with every war and every convulsion, we see growing awareness that the world is getting riskier and that there needs to be more planning and you need to have more of a clear sense of what the signals are because geopolitical risk is rearing its ugly head. Michelle, just as we're chatting, you talk to so many business leaders and you have such a great finger on the pulse of geopolitical risk. Do you feel like people are aware of these issues, or what direction is their awareness going in?
I think there is a growth of understanding in the sense that national security is now something that businesses, at least here in the United States, need to be mindful of. And we've seen over the past, let's say, decade, things like corporate social responsibility, like paying attention to ESG, environment, social and governance standards. All of these things become top of mind for businesses. But the geopolitical landscape has changed it and added one, which is now national security, because we've seen what Russia has done in Ukraine. We've seen what China has done in terms of genocide in Xinjiang, cyber attacks and being poised for them in the United States. We know of the threat to Taiwan. And so these things are becoming, I think, more than just headlines at the bottom of the TV screen. And they're really becoming tangible in terms of not just how does this impact my business, how does this impact my life, how does it impact my family, how does it impact my country and my business. And so I think it's growing and hopefully will grow at an increased rate. But the idea that national security needs to be a space that a business is thinking about because of the human rights associated with it, because of our freedom that's associated with it, I think it's becoming more top of mind. And we'll start to see a generation of business leaders emerge where that's actually a native understanding and that there is a sense of responsibility to advance national security versus just avoid geopolitical risk.
I think that's very well said.
There's also an inverse business trend, and the Wall Street Journal has done some good reporting on this, but rather than U.S. companies knowingly or unknowingly doing business and supporting the PRC, on the other side of it, lawmakers and media, especially here in the United States, have been calling attention to Chinese companies who've been blacklisted by the United States government for their affiliations with the Chinese military, operating under different brands here in the United States. So they're domiciled, they have a different name, so they can continue to operate here, nonetheless being a part of a blacklist by the Pentagon or the US government. And one example is Chinese LiDAR maker Hesai. And they've gotten some attention lately and most recently have sued the US government, but they're on the Department of Defense list for having affiliations with the Chinese military. And LiDAR is light detection and ranging. They use lasers and remote sensing, and especially in automotive, so that you can sense the environment around. Really cool technology, but definitely some national security concerns about sensitive data collection across the United States. And so they've been flagged and a lot of news coverage. But they've also got an entity in Michigan called American LiDAR. And unless you were really closely tracking this, that can be a challenge for other business partners doing business with an entity like that. Another example is China's BGI. They're also on an entity list for some of the biotech national security concerns. But they just changed their name in Massachusetts from BGI Americas to Enomics. Sounds very benign. How can business leaders keep up with this? It almost sounds like it's impossible to do all of this due diligence, but what are some best practices and tips that you would have?
So first off, it's funny to see Chinese companies do this because naming in China is so heavily regulated. So you can't start a business in China and call it China Solar unless you have close ties to the party. The name China, the name of Chinese cities in a company name is one of the best ways of knowing whether or not a company is state-owned or not. With the new world of geopolitical risk and with the heavy scrutiny that Congress, but also governments in Europe, in Japan, and South Korea place on ties with China, we highly recommend companies, as part of their normal due diligence practice and their vendor screening, start looking at China ties. And it's not an either or. It's not, oh, you can't work with American LiDAR, you can't work with Canadian Solar, another Chinese company, or you can't work with Ameriway, which is what branch of Huawei America is called. But you should take that risk factor into account, just like you should look at what is this company's climate policies, how much are they polluting, what are other types of ethical violations, what are other types of risks that we have with a supplier. Again, it's really important for people to understand it's not an either or. It's not you either work with China or you don't. It's you are already working with China. You already have, in some diffuse ways, ties to the Communist Party. How do you manage those risks so that you don't get into the government crosshairs or into the crosshairs of someone waging a pretty nasty PR campaign against you?
So say you're a U.S. business or a business in any of our partnered or allied countries, and you're aware of this, you're checking for signals, you're doing due diligence, and you get approached by or there's a business opportunity to do business in or with a PRC-related company that could potentially get in the crosshairs of Beijing and DC. How do you turn that down? How do you say no without the potential for some retaliation, which we know the Chinese government has been known to do? Sporadically, kind of hard to predict, but it has, and that's part of the strategy, but it has happened. So if you're a US company and you're doing all of this and you're well aware of the risks and you're about to say no, how can you do that while mitigating the risk of retaliation?
So first off, it's really important, and I know I talk a lot about culture here, but it's really important to have a company culture where salespeople and everyone in every part of the business can say no to a deal that smells wrong. It's a really good way to lower the risk of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations or other SEC or bribery violations. Everyone must be able to say no, hey, this is the wrong deal for us. You brought up a really good point on retaliation. That's a very real risk. And one way to minimize it is to not have the Chinese staff as directly involved in these engagements. Again, not because they're not brilliant, but because they're a lot more vulnerable. They have family in China. They might live there themselves. And so that makes retaliation a lot easier. In terms of Beijing's retaliation on a company level, say closing down stores or saying that there's a major tax issue, it requires businesses to not tell their Chinese partners, hey, I'm not working with you because I don't like the party or because I don't like Xi Jinping or what you're doing in Xinjiang, but to have these be part of normal business restructurings and making it clear that the way you communicate about this very much requires some finesse.
Now, you've recently developed at Strategy Risks a strategy risks index. And this was fascinating. You and I walked through it together, but it's a suite of indices. And what you've done is help rank companies on their exposure to different countries globally. China is one of them. And it helps companies make better decisions around offensive, defensive, force multiplier strategies around their global activities. And it helps raise this awareness that you've been saying is sort of step number one in protecting your business from geopolitical risk. Talk to me a little bit about how did that index come about, and what are some use cases for business leaders in order to make use of this type of data about their company exposure?
So people who run businesses or senior businesses have so much intimate understanding of where they are and where they need to be, and they just need good data to be able to really better understand these risks. It came out for me of researching a book and seeing that ties to Beijing and ties to China were the most important and murkiest and least talked about risk factor. So there's so many different ways that businesses have to measure their exposure to climate change or their links to any other major risk over the sun. But everything around China has been so sensitive that people are ignoring the issue or not talking about it explicitly. And so I thought it would be very valuable to give businesses a tool that says, here's your competitors, here's the companies in your supply chain, here's their links to China, so that you can make good, actionable decisions based on this. And in terms of use cases, say you're a major semiconductor company and you understand that if you pull out of China too early, you lose hundreds of millions of dollars. If you pull out too late, say because Beijing invaded Taiwan or because there's a blockade or because there's new restrictions from the US government, you lose hundreds of millions of dollars or more. And so tracking very closely where other companies in your space are, like using a data-driven AI perspective, can help you very, very concretely with timing. Or you're a public-facing pension fund and you understand that, yes, your bosses want to make sure that you reach alpha, but you also have to be careful about making sensitive investments that could get you in trouble. And this is a very handy screening tool for that. Or you're an insurer and you feel like you have a lot of risks covered, but you haven't looked at this form of risk. And you can use this data outlaid with a lot of the other wonderful data sets you have that measure risk and see a very important novel form of risk with it.
Isaac, we've covered a lot today in terms of what businesses need to know about doing business in China, potentially for the Chinese government, how to avoid that and how to navigate these new geopolitical risks that didn't exist necessarily even a few years ago. So thank you for offering these insights, your perspective and expertise to our learners here at the Tech Diplomacy Academy. And I look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it.